Welcome to the Prison Pod, a podcast for all people experiencing incarceration. The mission of this podcast is to save lives, restore hope, reduce suffering, and recidivism. Many show ideas come directly from the listeners, so please write the host. Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine, 04473. Here is your host, Ms. Valerie.
Hello, I'm so thankful to be back again on the Prison Pod with you. As usual, we have a guest, and I'm really excited about this guest because when I first found out about her, I saw Feminist Criminologist, and I was like, oh, a sociologist, a criminologist, and a woman who works with women. So I was really excited to find out about Kathryn, and I should have asked you before, Kathryn, is it Whiteley? Is that how you pronounce your last name?
Hi, Valerie. Yes, it is. It's Whiteley.
Whiteley. Okay. I'm so glad you've joined us today, Kathryn. And I'm going to start right off with asking you about the work that you have done and the research that you've done around women.
Thank you, Valerie. It's lovely to speak with you today. It started almost 2 decades ago. I decided to research women that were incarcerated for violent crimes. Now, that did include murder and sex offending. 20 years ago plus, when I lived in Australia, I was privy or able to get into a prison in Australia, Melbourne, Australia, and interview, at that stage, 7 women that were incarcerated for, shall we say, a violent crime such as murder or manslaughter, homicide, depending on the term used, which they do use in Australia. And from there, though, I originally went in wanting to learn more about the crime, the criminality, possibly like what everyone else wants to or wanted to do at that time. Now, this is going back 20 years ago. But it was several of those 7 women, a small cohort of women, but several of those women reminded me when I first started interviewing them, one-on-one individual interviews, that they were more than the crime. And they basically said to me very openly, Dr. Whiteley or Kate or Kathryn, I get called a few names, if you really want to know about us and our crime, you have to take a step back and you have to know and get to know us personally, individually. In other words, don't go down the path of let's talk about the crime and what happened. Step back and find out more and learn more about us. And it really was a moment for me. I really had to regroup personally and professionally and think, yes, it makes so much sense because we are quick to judge women, generally speaking, in the prison system. We're quick to judge because of the crime they committed, but less of us decide to learn more about the women themselves. So that was a changing moment for me in the course of my research from Australia moving forward.
So then I found out about a really important piece of this puzzle. I was doing a little research on you, and I came across something on YouTube, and it was a piece called Until We Have Faces. I have to tell you, I've watched it 3 times. I've cried all 3 times.
Oh.
It really touched me. And I'd like you to talk a little bit about that and also a little about the meaning behind the title.
Thank you. Thank you, Valerie. So from Australia, and I'll just share my journey across to the United States. And now I live in central Pennsylvania. I decided that as a professor, I was employed in a college or a university here. And I thought, well, the goal of coming as a visiting professor is that I want to immerse myself more again within the prison system here, but again, focusing on women that are incarcerated for long to life sentences that have committed a violent crime, because that is my research agenda. And again, learning more about these women. So over the years since I've been here, and I've been fortunate enough, I was able to go to SCI Muncie here in Pennsylvania and go through, of course, the rigorous process of having to, complete an institutional review board, paperwork for the Department of Corrections. So it does take time. However, that 12-month period of that process, as much as it was challenging for me, I never give up. I'm pretty tenacious that way, I suppose. But my goal was, other than going in and constantly interviewing women as a researcher, I thought, why not break away a little bit and do something from a social media or a physical platform, like having or being able to show the women more as real, as a human being. And I thought the best way to do that would be to approach it through a documentary. Now, Until We Have Faces, Women Serving Life, it is an educational documentary, as you probably realised, Valerie. It's not one of those you're going to sit around, have popcorn, and probably feel really great afterwards, right? So having said that, again, we went through all the hoops, and I'm very grateful to the Department of Corrections here for allowing us to do so. What was behind this? As I said, I just didn't want to do interviews and then write about them and publish the women's stories in research articles or chapters of books. So again, to bring the women more to life, that's the reason behind the educational documentary. Until We Have Faces, my colleague, who's a Canadian professor and now back in Canada, he thought about, we're going to go into this prison. Both of us talked about this. We're going to go into this prison, but in Pennsylvania, we were not able or permitted to show the women's faces. We could record and show, shall we say, pieces of the women or places within the prison itself, and women, standing there side on without actually showing their faces, because that is part of the law here in Pennsylvania. So when we, working through the stages of the application and then realizing the feedback was, yes, you could come in and you certainly can produce an educational documentary, but you are not privy to their faces. So that's where the title came, Until We Have Faces. Then we will feel more human. Then we will be the women that we perceive to be, or that we have become years later of serving a life sentence. That's how it came about, Valerie.
I love that. You did a wonderful job with the film. The whole crew did a nice job with the pieces that you picked and the music in the background. It was just very well put together. And I want to recommend anyone out there listening, if you have not seen it, Until We Have Faces, Women Serving Life is available on YouTube. So please go check it out. I guarantee you it will move you. So there's something else that's just recently come on Netflix. And I had a chance to read what you had to say about this. I forgot the name of the show.
Are you talking about a woman called
Genius.
Marjorie, Evil
Yes.
Genius, and a woman I work closely with, Marjorie Deal Armstrong? Yes?
Yes. So they've done a Netflix film series, and it was supposed to not sensationalize everything, but I think that kind of happened in the series. Am I right?
From my perspective, and for mine alone, I believe so. The goal is, I suppose, for women that have committed a violent crime, and I don't condone violence. But in this instance, I do believe that there was sensationalism, certainly pointed towards her or Marjorie. And I think part of that was because she was a female. because we do know, Valerie, that, it's only 10% of our overall violent crimes are committed by women. So when a woman does commit a violent crime, it is certainly, particularly with the media platform, sensationalized. And I believe that's possibly what happened with Marjorie.
Right. And this is one thing I think that both of us, when we started doing this work, of course, it was because we were interested in crime, the crimes itself, and forensics, and how you go about finding witnesses and what happens in court. But then when you start doing the work, at least me as a sociologist, we look at people and how they got from point A to point B, where a lot of times when you see things in the newspaper and when it's all over the news, it's only about that few seconds, sometimes a click, and that then defines them for the rest of their lives. And I think one thing that you and I both have tried to do is take the time to listen to the whole story. And maybe that needs to be done more.
Absolutely. Good point, Valerie. And I have found that over the years, what started out as I said, a research agenda, has become my calling. It has become my life. And I say that with, through being humble, because to get to know these women over the years, nearly, as I said, 20 years or so, to be able to access these women, you have to be authentic. You give up a lot of your time, which I have, but I have no regrets. But getting to know the women like yourself, getting to know these women, because they are a smaller cohort that most of society wish not to know about, except, as you mentioned, about the sentencing and what happened at the scene of the crime. So I'm dedicated to working with these women, and I have continued to do so through, this could be the sociological, criminological, and even the psychological lens, because when I'm working or when I'm engaged with one woman on a one-on-one, I'm hearing so much more than I ever anticipated to learn about them. So I think that's part of my process, is that understanding that these women, any woman that I come or engage with, has a story to tell, and going back to the childhood and understanding their pathway to where they are now, usually still inside, many serving life and life without parole here in Pennsylvania or in the United States, because I've worked in Texas as well. It's recognizing that these women can change. These women were children, little girls, youth, some of them, young girls growing up. But in many of their stories, 20 and 30 years later, and how I've engaged with them, 10, 15 years later, they have grown up. They have changed. And this is so important to the key of understanding who these women have become. And like at the very beginning, what you alluded to is that, as I've been told, women are sharing with me, I am more than the crime. I am more than what I committed 20, 25 years ago, 15 years ago. One woman, Valerie, and we'll talk maybe a little bit about this later on, has served 52 years in Pennsylvania. Now, again, I stress I don't condone violence, but there is such a story about her. And has she changed? The woman that I have met today, from her storytelling, from her having the opportunity, I believe she has. I believe she has.
Well, the one thing, too, is when you look at trauma that happens before incarceration that is unaddressed, sometimes mental illness, families that may have been addiction going on or neglect, you start adding all of these things up, then the person ends up in prison because they are in the wrong circumstances, whatever brings them there. Once they're there, they're usually looked at by a medical team and a psychological team. So a lot of these issues that brought them into the prison system are now addressed that haven't been before. So then you have stabilization, which some of these people that have come into prison haven't had for many years. So they have stability, they have a place to live, they're getting their basic needs met, and medication sometimes, counseling. From that point, then there's many that have educational opportunities.
Yes.
And
yes.
if they went in young, before 25, and the frontal lobe of the brain development hasn't even been completed yet, all of those things are why I believe life without parole sentences should be re-looked at after a period of time. I do believe that there are sometimes underlying circumstances, not excuses. I am just like you. I am not saying there are any excuses for violent crime. That's not the case here. What I'm saying is how much punishment do we need to deal out to people that sometimes have already had a pretty crappy life before they ever went to jail?
Absolutely. A great point, Valerie. And I'd just like to share with listeners, I have, shall we say, researched women in the Australian prison system. I have worked with women in the United States prison system, in Pennsylvania and in Texas. And I've also researched and worked with women, or continue to work with women in the Dublin or the Irish prison system. So I'm taking a step back here about not just the trauma, but the longevity. And this also plays into what each woman receives whilst they're incarcerated. And when we talk about life or a life without parole sentence, when I've spoken to women in the Docha Centre in Dublin, Ireland, they have mentioned, or they have talked about, well, what is the sentencing like, or the experience for women that have committed a violent crime in the United States. So it's a lovely comparative, shall we say, conversation I've had with them. And they are somewhat bewildered at this sentence length, as you mentioned, life or life without parole, because many of the women in the Irish prison system, or in the Docha Centre, they will possibly be out within the 16-year period for committing a very similar crime. Well, we see here in the United States, third degree or second degree, 25, 30 years, or then first degree can be a life without parole. Australia very much the same in the sense when it comes to the sentencing, a shorter sentencing compared to what we have here in the United States. So going back to something you touched on about the trauma and, and what they endure once they are incarcerated on top of possibly what they did prior to being incarcerated, a lot of the impact depends upon the longevity of their sentence as well. I recall a woman in Ireland saying to me, and she said, Dr. Kate, she called me, it was really lovely hearing her say this, and she said, we've got nothing to complain about. She said, we're going to be out soon in a few years, but she said, what about those women in the United States? She said, she couldn't comprehend the length or the longevity of their sentencing and the impact of growing old or aging in a prison system. So there's so much, I suppose, Valerie, when I get started to unpack here. But all of these pieces of information I draw upon or draw out of the women, because the women are the best storytellers. They're doing, they're walking the walk. So they can talk about, I've been in here 10 years, this is what's happened, this is what's not happening, compared to someone that has been in a very short sentence. My goal is always, as you understand, Valerie, is to have the women be the educators. That's what I wish to take from all my research from traveling around the countries. Let's listen to what these women have to say. And the longer that they have been sentenced, let's pay more attention to that. What are we learning from that, or what are we not learning from that we can do better as a, shall we say, a criminal justice system?
You brought up a really good point there. I imagine that a large majority of these women are mothers. So we have another whole level here with the children of the mothers who were incarcerated, and then what happens to those children through the trauma of that.
Oh, absolutely. And something I just want to share the two, Valerie, is that a woman that I've known for many years, she was 16 and she was incarcerated in our criminal justice system here in the United States. And she shares on the podcast that I've done, she shares how she grew up inside the prison. She doesn't even know what it's really like to be a young girl or a young woman. She basically grew up in a prison. She's in her 30s now, and she's serving a life sentence. She will be paroled, but she's serving a life sentence. So her story, and it's interesting you talk about mothers or being mothers, her grief and having to work through that was that never being a mother by the time she is released. So you've got that, interesting side of discussion. And then, like you touched on, how relevant and important it is that there are mothers that are entering, particularly the United States criminal justice system, who have left little children, little babies, and will never be there literally to grow up, seeing and loving and nurturing their child or children because of the choices they made.
I never thought about the women getting to the age where they couldn't have children anymore. And we just addressed a little while ago, there was a conversation that happened about how hard it is for women to go through menopause in prison. And, I just automatically thought those women had children. But that's a really valid point that, especially if you go in older, you only have so many childbearing years, and that is quite a thing to have to give up.
Absolutely, Valerie. And again, this is a piece of the discussion that I have with the women. We talk about childhood, we talk about their teenage years, or they discuss their teenage years and their childhood. But then also they talk about, growing older. They talk about, it could be education. It could be a lack of, shall we say, social support, because as we both understand is that the longer, an example for the women, the longer they are incarcerated, the less social support or family support that they have usually, because everyone grows up, grows away. I just wanted to share that with all of my research, and I don't even feel it's research these days because it's just something I'm passionate about, is that there's so many topics, Valerie, that the women discuss, and I don't force them into a conversation or, a standover tactic of an interview. I like to be relaxed. I like to say, well, look, let's start on these particular topics and let's work our way through. So it's, wow, you name it. I've talked about many things, or the women have told me many things about their lives.
I have a question. Since you worked in other countries other than the United States, and the women get out, have you had the opportunity to follow any of the women once they've come out of prison?
Interestingly enough, the very first few women in Australia, the 7 women, and I just want to share that's quite a large cohort because Australia is a very small country. Those women have, of course, been released several years ago. I haven't had the chance to follow up with them. Here in the United States, in Pennsylvania and in Texas, other than one woman I followed up with who was commuted here in Pennsylvania, the other ladies or other women are still incarcerated. And in Ireland, the women there are still incarcerated, but within the next few years, it is understood that they will be, shall we say, released. So I haven't had the time, I suppose, to follow up and visit them once they have been or had been released. But I do want to share, Valerie, is that any of the women that are still incarcerated, if I get the chance to visit geographically, because I travel quite a little bit, I do go back and visit. I do visit the women in Ireland. I'm in contact with the women in Texas. We physically write letters. So I try not to, the best I can, to abandon the women. And I know that sounds, abandonment is a huge term to use, but just having a letter or a phone call. So I'm still constantly in touch with many of the women because most of the women that I'm still close to or engaged with, they're still inside, Valerie.
I'm really curious. Have you worked with any women who are on death row?
Oh, I'm glad you asked that. Yes, I have. Would you believe in the not in the podcast, I'll take a step back, in the documentary, one of the women there that's in the documentary, Until We Have Faces, she had served 21 years on death row. Now, and she talks, so that's a lovely piece when you mentioned about Until We Have Faces, Women Serving Life, that the educational documentary. There is, as I mentioned, one woman served 21 years and she was commuted. But there are some other women that I know in the very, very near future wish to talk to me and share their story, who were commuted. So, yeah.
I'm interested. As you know, I do work with the men that are on death row at Central Prison in North Carolina. So I'm always interested in, the different levels because, as you know, there are many different layers in prisons from minimum to death row. There's many, many, many steps in between. So
that's right.
Okay, now you've been doing some podcasts recently, am I right?
You certainly are.
So let's talk about that a little bit. Tell me what's going on there.
Oh,
so
thank you for asking.
You.
Oh, you're wonderful. And vice versa. Thank you very much. It's called Identities, Conversations with Convicted Women. Now, it's a podcast series of 10 women. This is our last week. We have the 10th woman this week, tomorrow, and her name is Heather. Now, with the podcast series, and I'd love to share this, we titled it, because you're probably going to ask me, how did we come up with that title? Throughout my years of research or working with the women, it's always been focused on who are they? What is their self-identity? So I suppose that is something that navigates its way in through all my research, is understanding who they are. So the self-identities came about because I wanted them to share, who are you? I wanted us to know who you were, but through your narrative lens. So self-identities, it's all about the women sharing their identity. But the conversations with convicted women, at the very beginning, Valerie, you talked about how we sensationalize. I did not want to put the term conversations with convicted women for murder. I did not want to do that. Hence, this is why it is conversations with convicted women. So not by just myself, my wonderful partner in crime, I call him AJ, and I hope he listens to this. We both came up with the title that we're not here to sensationalize. It is a conversation. It's not an interrogation podcast. It's not an interview podcast. There's a difference how we approach that. And again, it came back to the core of what I do. I would like for the woman to speak on her behalf. And we listen about her through her words, not someone else, even including myself, writing her words for me or for anyone else, not as a researcher. So again, we are grateful. We were given the opportunity to go into Pennsylvania, SCI Muncie again in Pennsylvania. And as I said, tomorrow is the last week of this particular series. And that's all I'm going to say at this moment, this particular series. The other little piece to that is that we are also in the process of further negotiating other, shall we say, women's maximum security prisons around the country to follow this through. But it is about women. Each woman speaks to me about her life. And all I do, I sit down in a prison, and this is significant too, Valerie, as you understand. You have to work hard and you have to gain trust in order to do a podcast inside a prison. Correct? Inside a maximum security prison. So we were we were permitted to do that, and I'm forever grateful. And so we went in there over a few days, and you know what's lovely about the podcast, Valerie, and to the listeners, we were also given the opportunity for each woman, after we completed the podcast, my partner in crime, AJ, after he completed each podcast, we were given the opportunity for each woman individually to hear themselves talk, to hear themselves speak.
That's really great because a lot of times they never get to hear anything that they do. And when their art goes out, they don't get to see it. And so that's really remarkable that they got to listen to them. That was really great that the facility, facilitated allowing that.
Can I share also, and again, this is part of learning who these women are, and thank you for saying that, Valerie. Key to that was each woman walked away and she was in tears. And I'm not saying the podcast is to make each woman cry, but it really showed how it impacted them because the words were, I did not know I sounded like that. Or is that me? They could not believe they actually had a voice and were hearing themselves. It was humbling, and I have to share, I too come to tears sometimes behind closed doors. I shed a tear, and I'm always grateful that these women have allowed me the opportunity.
Now, how can people hear this podcast?
Well, any particular iHeartRadio, Spotify, any of those, shall we say, podcast platforms, it is out there now. And as I said, tomorrow, the woman the woman that's going to be presented on the 10th week, her name is Heather, and a very gracious woman. So, yes, it's called Self-Identities, Conversations with Convicted Women, but any of those, shall we say, podcast platforms. And Valerie, we're happy to say that we have the English, we have the Aussies, we have the Kiwis, we have many, as well as the Americans listening to this podcast. So I'm very grateful.
That's really great. I wish you guys a lot of success with it because I think it's going to be really big.
Thank you.
People love this stuff, especially the people like you and I, that are in the field, especially. I would really like to see some of the colleges start assigning some of these podcasts as assignments because, for one thing, they get so burnt out reading, and it would give, the younger generation really likes the social media more than they do a book.
You're right, Valerie, and I'm. That's part of the navigation in the process is for anyone that's teaching, gender and crime or criminology or victimology. Even some of these women have certainly been victims. These an ideal podcast, and including your podcast too, Valerie. I must share that as well. A great educational tool.
I want you to mention your website, so if people want to get in touch with you or find out more about you.
Thank you, Valerie, for this opportunity. So it's Kathryn, Kathryn, M. Whiteley, WHITELEY.com. So Kathryn M. Whiteley, all one word, .com. If you wish to contact. And again, myself, AJ, or any of us are very happy to talk further and discuss what we did. But what the women did, Valerie.
Yes, exactly. I love what you're doing. I can't wait to see what the future brings. I just found out about the podcast. So that's what I'll be doing this weekend on my day off. Because I'm really anxious to check out, I really work mostly with men. I have worked with some women in the past, but it would be nice to hear what the women are doing and what they have to say in their stories too.
Oh, I appreciate it, Valerie. And the lucky last thing I wish to say is that it is a labour of love, just like what you do with the males in imprisonment. This is not something that's rewarded or many people wish to, I won't say not support, but you probably find this. I've been a little bit like, well, why would you want to work with them? Really? It has been. I'm sure you've felt that too in some instances. But I'm like you. I'm tenacious. I soldier on, and I'm very passionate about this 10% cohort of women that are serving time for violent crime.
You definitely have to want to do the work. There's no doubt about it. I want to thank you again, Kathryn, for joining us today on the Prison Pod. It's really been a pleasure to talk to you. And I think we're going to have to catch up again in a few months and find out what your new projects are.
Thank you, Valerie. It has been an honor. And thank you, listeners. You're the best. Thank you so much.
You have been listening to the Prison Pod, a podcast not just for those in prison but for anyone who has been affected by incarceration. Ms. Valerie would love for you to write to her with your questions, comments, and show ideas. The address is Prison Pod, Post Office Box 294, Orono, Maine. 04473. Remember, reading opens doors, so pick up that book.